Hi, everyone. Welcome to another installment of One Book, One New Orleans virtual programming. We are very excited to bring you tonight's program, The Matrix of Creativity, Imagining Freedom in Louisiana and Mississippi, which is co-sponsored by One Book, One New Orleans and the University of New Orleans Press. So thank you to our partners this evening over at UNO Press. Before we get started, I'd like to tell you a little bit about what One Book, One New Orleans is, for those of you who don't know. One Book, One New Orleans selects one book every year, hence our name, and we encourage everyone in the city to read the same book at the same time, with the idea that we will grow stronger as a city through a shared reading experience. Now, in doing that, we have to recognize that we have approximately a 27% functional illiteracy rate among our adults here in the greater New Orleans area. And we also are the most incarcerated city in the U.S. So we have to do an extra layer of outreach to make sure that when we say we're One Book, One New Orleans, we are reaching those folks who would normally be excluded from a community of readers. So we develop a curriculum around our book, and we get our book and its curriculum free of charge into adult ed classes, high-sec classes, adult ESL classes, classes in juvenile detention facilities, adult prisons, and then we also get our books into the ears of the blind and print handicapped through a partnership with WRBH Reading Radio, which records our book and broadcasts it cover to cover. We also, in order to make sure that those New Orleanians who maybe can read but don't have the extra money for books can access the book, we make sure our partners at the New Orleans Public Library all have copies at their branches so that you can go and you can get the book for free, and we know that it's there and that you can get it. So what's the book? And how do we bring our community together? Well, every year, inspired by the book, we hold a series of free family-friendly events. They're typically in different neighborhoods across the city. That way, if you don't have transportation, you know One Book, One New Orleans is coming to your neighborhood once a year at least. This year, obviously, we're virtual. Hopefully, we'll be able to all see our people and hug each other soon, but until then, we're really happy we can be here, celebrating our 2020 selection. New Orleans Griot, the Tom Dent Reader, edited by Kalamuya Salam. So, Tom Dent, among the other things that he really emphasizes in this book, talks a lot about how artistic movements and civil rights movements are very much intertwined. And him linking those two ideas was the conversation catalyst for this evening, The Matrix of Creativity, Imagining Freedom in Louisiana and Mississippi. So we have with us tonight three speakers whose work really does intersect with that idea of freedom. And those three speakers are Dr. Anna Beatrice Scott, who has her doctorate in performance studies from Northwest University and extensive training in traditional collaborative performance from the African diaspora. She's a trained ethnographer with over 25 years experience in the field. And she's currently an assistant professor of speech and theater at Rust College. We also have Kristina Kay Robinson, who is a writer, curator, and visual artist born and raised in New Orleans. Her ongoing installation and performance art project, Republica, Temple of Color and Sound, has been presented in exhibition at Welcome to the Afrofuture. And her writing in various genres has appeared in Guernica, The Nation, and Elle, among others. She's currently the New Orleans editor-at-large for the Atlanta-based Burn Away magazine. And also we have with us Danielle Littlefield, who is an Afro-Mississippi writer, editor, and professor. She's a regular contributor to creative and literary projects in Memphis and Mississippi, in that region. And she works to document and preserve Black culture and vernacular from the American South. She's a two-time Callaloo Fellow, and she's currently an assistant professor of English at Rust College, which is an HBCU in Holly Springs, Mississippi. And she's a contributing fiction editor at Obsidian, Literature and Arts in the African Diaspora. So without further ado, I am going to turn it over to the three speakers whose bios I greatly shortened and who can tell you way more about their amazing work than I did. Welcome, Dr. Scott, Kristina, and Danielle.
Hi.
Hi.
Hello. Hello. Thank you all for joining us this evening to discuss New Orleans Griot, the Tom Dent reader. I'm really happy to be able to talk about this book. It is an excellent and necessary volume of literature right now. It's edited by Kalamu Yasalam. And I really do want to take a second to really thank Kalamu for his work as a New Orleans griot himself, and also the work he did editing this book. If you've read it already, you may have read this part where they talk about the volume of work that Tom Dent produced.
Yes.
Said it measured like 149 feet, I think it says. So the work he did in distilling Tom Dent's work into one volume of literature that is so reader friendly, without reducing kind of the heft of what Tom Dent has to offer. I really, really appreciate the work he put into it, and also sort of the work he did to preserve his friend, peer, and mentor's creative legacy. So I just wanted to take a second to thank Kalamu for that, and also mention that he has a book out right now that's called Be About Beauty, and reading those two books together, I really highly recommend it because they're so in conversation with one another, obviously, as the two writers have been in conversation with each other over history. So kind of what I'm going to do to start off is I'm going to read an excerpt that's from an essay I wrote about the Tom Dent reader, I guess a couple years ago. I'm going to read a little excerpt from it, sort of just to set the stage for our introductory discussion, and then we're going to kind of go from there and see sort of where things take us, right? So it opens with a quote that's from the introduction of the Tom Dent reader, and this is coming from Kalamu. He says, "Certainly, I had decided to be a writer before I met Tom. Certainly, I was my own man. But Tom became more than a mentor, more than a friend. Tom became my father. Before Tom, I never consciously thought about what it meant to be a Black New Orleanian. Since Tom, I've never stopped contemplating what has become a lifelong commitment, learning from, propagating, documenting, and loving Black New Orleans. Ultimately, our second line culture enables us to elegantly deal and dance even with death. Individually, each of us will sooner or later expire. Collectively, we will never die." And so this is sort of the excerpt, beginning of the excerpt from my essay. In Amiri Baraka's 1965 essay, The Revolutionary Theater, Baraka describes the imagination as a practical vector from the soul. It is an infinite database bank from which Baraka said we can draw the solutions to any problem. For Black writers living in the South during the Black Power movement, one of those problems might have been how to make the concepts around cultural nationalism promoted by Black Power and its cultural ring, Black arts, reflect the specific experience and radical potentiality of Black Southerners and their land. University of New Orleans Press's most recent volume, New Orleans Griot, the Tom Dent Reader, edited by Black Arts South most gifted writer Kalamu Yasalam, is a literary celebration of the Black imagination, a close look at a people's epic journey across the world. Tom Dent's work across various genres, including fiction, poetry, nonfiction, and drama, tells a story not just of loss, but also of retention of Africa in the daily lives and practices of Black New Orleanians. Because of the breadth of his work and special attention to the story of retention, Salam posits Dent as the greatest writer New Orleans has ever produced. To be truly radicalized is to understand rebellion not as a mere reaction to someone else's actions, but as the total expression of the collective self. How the collective genius of Black people and Black New Orleans can be specifically employed as a roadmap through the uncertain future is distilled with stunning clarity in this expertly crafted text. To understand how New Orleans became a matrix of creativity, as Dent describes to Dr. Jerry Ward in a 1986 interview, we have to take a look back, further back than the triangular diagram of spices, rum, and human beings that history usually presents as the origin story of Black Americans. In Beyond Rhetoric, Dent presents an alternate triangle, the one between Greenville, Natchez, Jackson, Mississippi, as a place so topographically and spiritually akin to Africa that it seemed a logical place for a Black nation. So that's sort of kind of the overall world we're sort of entering the conversation in, thinking about this conversation that Tom Dent sees between Louisiana and Mississippi, and how crucial he sees these two states in sort of the story of America and then kind of the greater story of Black people in the world. So I kind of wanted to start us off thinking about kind of how do we see some of these collective practices, either of the past, or in the present. How do we see some of the collective practices of Black Southerners sort of as a roadmap, a cultural or practical even roadmap through sort of the time we're dealing with right now, the time that causes us to be having this conversation, in this format. Right. Yeah. So whoever wants to go first can.
I'm inclined to pass to Anna first. I tend to over talk.
Go, Danielle. I will just swoop in at the bottom.
Okay. I want to first kind of comment on what I'm thinking of as kind of daily practice in the South and general community culture, not necessarily first practices that have grown out of artists or writer collectives, right? So I'm thinking first of what I call church announcement culture. So I want to kind of talk about that for a second. We both Anna and I teach at Russ College, which is a small HBCU, private HBCU in Mississippi. One of the things that used to drive me crazy there that I have not just recently, but really learned to accept as something that encourages me both as a writer, an artist, and a member of my community is this church announcement culture. At Russ, sometimes you may get an email that says, Sister Mary Jenkins' brother is sick, and can you pray for him? This other person has this going on. And the floor is kind of always open for people to announce whatever it is they need to announce. On maybe every couple of weeks, I get an email newsletter from Celie McInnes. He's C.Liegh McInnes, who's a professor and writer at Jackson State. And it is, I think every one of them starts with, hey, y'all. And then there is a litany of announcements about calls for submissions, poetry groups that are performing or touring in Mississippi, events and festivals that are coming up, work that Celie is doing, work his friends are doing. If you send him the work you're doing, he's going to add it. It's literally a church bulletin almost. And we, the writers and artists who get that letter from him every couple weeks are the church. Right. And so receiving those announcements at times when I felt I couldn't be as active in the writing community, once I obviously had children, started to work, getting those newsletters made me feel a part of the community, that I still had an end, that whatever little work I felt was little to me still mattered to somebody. And so this kind of church announcement culture where everybody is included and everything is equal, to some degree, I think is kind of very important practice I see across the South. It can be annoying, but that means you have the right to annoy others when it's your turn to annoy them with your announcement.
Even Kalamu had a mailing list. You remember that list that he used to run?
Yes,
that was very much in that tradition of I was getting it. I was all the way in Brazil, like feeling left out because all the announcements that he was doing. But it was an important aspect of knowing when to focus your energy. I think that's one of those practical roadmap types of things that church bulletin culture puts you in the mindset of, like, very clearly, we must attend to this at this moment. Nothing else matters except for these people. And that's really interesting to have it always come back to the body, even though it's about, normally, we're always happy when it's great news, like somebody just got married, right? And it's like, woo, because everything else had been go by so-and-so funeral home, or you could send gifts to the bereaving family. But those moments really center the body in a way that is super important, but the body as a precious site of memory and practice, and not just a piece of reliquary, which is how we tend to get treated in the media.
I want to definitely bring up the vernacular tradition in general across the South, as I think is literally one of the most life-sustaining practices that we have in the Black South. I remember living in New York and constantly having debates with people about hip hop and rap and how the South was just getting rappers, you know, this kind of business. And I remember someone saying to me in one of these debates, why is it every song that comes out of the South got a dance to it? Y'all can't make a song without a dance to it. And I said, well, perhaps that's why everybody likes it more. So this kind of idea that the vernacular tradition, whether it is in language, whether it is music, whether it's gospel, it's church, or just simply how we talk to one another or express ourselves right in our homes with design, all of those things. I think the vernacular tradition drives home the point that for Black Southerners, things have to feel right. And they have to do what they're supposed to do. It doesn't matter if they're the right way to do them, if they don't somehow get where they're supposed to go. And so I think I credit the vernacular tradition in all its forms with grounding us in something that works, that gets us where we're supposed to go.
Sure. I participated maybe about a month ago in a talk that it was called Le Cœur Creole, and it means the Creole heart. And it was really focused on thinking about sort of this insurgent quality to basically the vernacular tradition in South Louisiana, right? That these Black people from various places end up in Louisiana, and over the course of, maybe about 200 years, a new vernacular stabilizes in the region that their master doesn't understand. And so thinking about how sustaining that was for hundreds of years for Black people in South Louisiana, and then comes this really, really violent rupture to that, say maybe late 30s, 40s, with the eradication basically of Creole being spoken in school or public, right? Kind of outright ban. So we had this language loss. But sort of at the same time, South Louisiana has really preserved a sort of unique English vernacular that definitely is a sustaining cultural attribute that I don't think we even really spend a lot of time thinking about at home, right? How much it has sustained the culture, and then just sustained you as a person throughout time. For instance, in a time of displacement, hearing people use certain words and being able to identify that they were from home by the sound of their voice and the particular words that they used, and how that provided some continuity in a moment of rupture. So yeah, I do think for sure that vernacular tradition for Black people, particularly in the South, has been extremely, extremely important for us, both for us to sustain culture and to continuously kind of recreate culture.
Right.
Through the use of our vernacular. Yeah.
Somewhat randomly, but in that same conversation where a couple of people where I was in New York at the time kind of were taking aim at the mumble rap, which was kind of just getting underway then. And I kind of instantly said that I see the mumble rap as a kind of natural progression in Black music, whereas we see the cycle of like new sounds and new movements in Black music that are eventually, we know, going to be co-opted and infiltrated. And so mumble rap being something that is born of the vernacular tradition because it is highly regional. It is very much about locality, and it is literally meant for you to not understand what it is they're saying unless you're from where they're from or a part of their group. And so it is very hard to imitate or infiltrate unless you are a part of it.
And I really appreciate that as well in the Time Dent Reader as you go through it. He spends a lot of time in his own work, and Kalama also spends a lot of time in the framing essays to continuously talk about sound and talk about music, especially in relationship to New Orleans and how it has been this sort of primary vehicle of which Black people moved information throughout the world, and how understanding that conceptually as a writer helps your writing travel if you understand this concept around music and sound as sort of this unifying principle that you can sort of find in the diaspora everywhere as a main mechanism of either cultural transmission, information transmission. It's always a part of whatever insurrection may have happened at any point in history. So it's just
not
interesting.
Just sounds without bodies. The thing that's really
interesting
for me is that it's fleshy sound, right? So that the sound is meant to move. The sound accounts for what the flesh is going to do with the sound. It's not just sound for the sake of sound. Like I think a lot about Akan architecture of the upper class there from Ghana back, really back, with the courtyard being designed specifically to amplify the drum set that was in there. It was all about communications at a distance without having to send somebody running down the field, right? You could actually send the language forward because people understood the sounds. So for me, this whole like hyper localized thing, often I start hearing little pieces of rhythms and beats that are really, really ancient. Thinking all the time about Sun Ra's idea of ancient to the future, where people, they're just resurfacing and bringing back almost often perfectly the syllables, right? The perfect rhythmic patterns for the thing they're trying to communicate, bringing it back. And that's really interesting for me and amazing to think about. Write that down, right? And then is that I guess the question is that the best time capsule forward? Because of, thinking about Tom Dent and all of the writing he had, I actually just realized that I kind of knew about his work, but I didn't fully know him. So like, what's a way that if we're going to be practical about working with the vernacular, how do we utilize it and how do we store it? Because a binary code, that's kind of an easy thing to pick up. But if we're going to store it in flesh, what are the methods that we need to teach people? Thinking LA like crip walking, for example, right? There's all kinds of information that's inside of that. And it's actually in Sibidi from the cross river area of Nigeria with the Igbo people, where they're using 2 lines to say a whole lot of things. But we're not thinking that it's writing when, the pictures are actually whole stories. What type of seed? What does it look like? How do we create that and move it forward? And then what does it take to reactivate it when it travels?
Well, for instance, in New Orleans, it's really interesting. They bring it up in the book a lot, like second line culture, right? In thinking about that, I think about second line culture, and I also think about the Black Mexican Indians, right? So every Sunday, Second Line season, a social aid and pleasure club leads a, citywide, it's in a certain location in the city, but basically anybody in the city can show up, right? And it's a procession through the street of traditionally Black people, right? Now, post-Katrina, we've had other people come, but traditionally this was something that only Black people would go to, right? And so this processional that happens regularly through the street has been happening, for a long time. So it has been sort of like a way for sound and bodies to move and carry information throughout the ages, right? And so when you see the particular style of dance that people are doing at the Second Line, they're doing, dances that are done, that have not been changed since they came from West Africa to Louisiana. And so you see this sort of living praxis. It's a weekly ritual that allows you to retain this information, right, and pass it on in practice, in real time, kind of continuously replicating. With the Black Masking Indians, it's really interesting because they sort of combine this idea that is brought from West Africa, this rhythmized textile where the suit actually tells a story, makes a sound, right? And usually sometimes, depending on what group, has a narrative, right? So certain groups do more geometric, others do more pictorial, but all of them sort of transmit information beyond what can be written on the page, right? So the way sort of Tom Dent and Kalamu as well sort of interact with how the living praxis of New Orleans translates into their work, and then vice versa, I find to be just a really, really strong example of what you're saying, of how do we preserve the vernacular, right? One way it's preserved is in this praxis of action, and then in the tangible object that those actions create. And that's the purpose of the suit, right? Is that it contains the history, it tells the story, and it gives you a tangible thing that you can hold. And it kind of, what's the word? It transcends. It's another form of literacy, right? It's another way to understand the word. And I think that Tom Dent understood that so well, and it's part of why you can digest this volume the way you can. Kalamu, I feel, understands it too. It's the part of the reason why he's able to distill this work in this way. That, like I said, there's no decrease in heft, but it also is extremely friendly to the person who's trying to wade through it. And I think that comes a lot from the communal culture and how you have to sort of you have to work within the schematic, and everybody has to be able to move through in order for it to happen. But I think a lot about those traditions and how they are able to preserve vernacular and move us through time. I know, Anna, you do a lot of your work is based in performance. I'm curious for you to tell us a little bit about it, and how maybe you see it doing some of this work we're talking about in terms of preserving vernacular through praxis and through movement.
Well, I am a performance artist, but I'm mostly dance-based. So I like to say that I make dance memory pieces.
Okay.
And they're often, because I'm also a scholar, they're often based in a research question that I have. So, that performance studies degree from Northwestern is much more about a longing for Catherine Dunham's school tightrope that no longer existed. And I couldn't find a program anywhere that would allow me to do the types of things I wanted to do. That degree came the closest. And like a relationship that sums it up kind of is a series of exchanges I I've had over the years with this architect, this Black architect, Craig Wilkins, out of Detroit. And it started as a joke. Can you dance about architecture? Thinking a lot about James Brown's music and the architecture of the 1970s, like having that sunken den and these long spaces so you can slide or you can get on the night train and do all of these different dances. But that the Black household and the architecture that held the Black sound was very much about collective moving, but also this notion that you are never where you actually are. That your practices, your thoughts are always elsewhere, and they're rooted in the elsewhere and transformative wherever your feet hit. So I've been thinking a lot about how it's possible to have several people in one location, but they're all in different spaces at the same time. So for example, a work that I'm allegedly finishing, I am definitely finishing it. I'm on part 2 of, it's called The Bliss Point, and it's about this character Caroline. That's the image in one of the things we circulated in the pink dress. She's actually 5 different people at once, all with the same name, and she speaks all these different languages, but every place she is she's that like fantasy thing of the mulatta lover of the slave owner, right? Which research is showing, nah, that didn't quite happen, but we have a lot of stories around that. So thinking a lot about resurfacing her memories and thinking about sugar as a curse. What does it mean to force someone to work on an object that is that intimate and not expect them to be cursing it the whole time they're working on it? But also, how does something that was forced labor then take in, like the result of forced labor, become the thing that we substitute for the word and the emotion love, sweetness, right? And it's a hyper artificial sweetness. It's not the sweetness of a honeysuckle, for example, that you suck on. It's not the sweetness of honey against your tongue. It's not the sweetness that hits the back of your tongue when you smell a rose. This is something else. So that's just an example of how my stuff moves. And so inside of that, there's all this math that's happening. I'm thinking a lot about the choreography. Isn't just steps. I'm thinking a lot about Fibonacci sequence these days because I'm really into biomimicry and really thinking about the cyclical nature of having to plant, tend to, and collect these unknown objects, essentially is what they were to people who were snatched and brought here. And then what does that do to the rhythms that you were used to? Because like the Yam Festival, Yoruba New Year is in June. But these people are talking about Happy New Year and it's dark and cold. It makes no sense. Where are the plants? So I'm constantly playing with what does that do to the body when your memories are not your own memories, but they're resurfacing and they're fighting against the presented reality? What types of conflicts happen? And then what types of new things do we find that we only find in performance?
It's really interesting because I do, I work in performance, or I've started in, say, like the past few years. And it's been really interesting kind of thinking about how imagining, a character that I work with, imagining the space that the character occupies, which is technically the same physical land that I occupy, but in completely different circumstances, right? How that compels my body to move different, me to speak different, me to move my hands different. And I think all of that, what's so fascinating to me about that is thinking about how Tom Dent and Free Southern Theater and all of the people who were participatory in this movement in the late 60s, how they really recognized that as an organization and sort of combined this really rigorous theater and community performance program with the writing workshop, and how, some of the people were strictly performance people, some people were strictly writers, but they write, Kalama talks about it a lot in some of his intro essays, how the combination and the dynamism encouraged him to write differently, perform differently, move differently in their art, do things they never thought about doing before, just from that sort of frenetic energy of realizing the relationship between the two. Yeah.
I want to just kind of add to that. I know one of the strengths for me in terms of being grounded in the Black Southern vernacular tradition, especially as a Black writer, and one of the reasons I was so intent on trying to build a program for young Black writers in the South is because when you are grounded in that Black vernacular tradition, because writing on the page can be so inadequate. You don't know that, especially to some degree, the more educated you become, the more you learn these kind of very high tier of academic vocabulary to write, to describe things and refer to things, where you use terms right now, what Zora Neale Hurston calls like cash words, right? Where you right, or barter words as opposed to credit card words, right, which are representative of a thing, not the actual physical thing. What that does when you have to write to the page, and especially when you are going to have to write or work with performance, is if what you're putting on the page doesn't hit the gut, doesn't cause the reaction in the body, doesn't recreate the feeling of the sound or of the visuals, of the spaces that you encounter, if what you put on the page doesn't rise to the standard, then you know it's not doing what it's supposed to do. I think it raises the bar, and in turn, Black writers, because of that, raise the bar for literature everywhere. Because what we do on the page often is somehow recreate physical spaces and vernacular sounds that are not intended, and literally change the meanings of words, change the laws of grammar, right? I think a lot of vernacular, like the boson particle, right? So like there is this physics, and there are these laws of physics that are supposed to work everywhere. And the boson particle is like, well, guess what? I'm here in space and time. I'm going to do something else. And y'all can all figure out how to get behind what I'm doing, because now it's different. I think working in Black vernacular performance and being grounded in that tradition just simply raises the bar for what you believe is even possible to create on the page.
Yeah, and then to take it from the page stage, right? So like in the performance aspect, there's this, you know, the coincidental relationship of the page to the stage, and there are these highly formalized things that are expected of you when you're dancing on the stage or doing a show on a stage that do not ever fit the Black vernacular process, ever. For example, I spent most of my 20s dancing in West African companies in what I call Africa West, Oakland, California. So to come from Africa South and then go and like be able to kick it with all of the, you know, people from the Congo and from Senegal, they're like, "Where are you from?" I was like, "I'm from Mississippi." And they're like, "But no, you're from home." I was like, "Exactly, you're correct." But these shows, we'd rent these, we'd four-wall these big theaters, and like all the Black people would show up from like Oakland and all around. And we couldn't keep them off the stage, right? Because that's part of it, you know. You do your part, you do your show, and you get people. There's even a section in the intro book. Actually, I watched a video of the free Southern theater folks, and they were talking about a moment where they started in on one of these freedom songs, moving towards the stage because they came from the back of the house to the front, and that is still a motif that's utilized to this day. And a lot of, like, when you're trying to be very much about the people are making the show, starting the back of the house to the stage. They did that, and they looked around, and they were all on stage in their character, but there was this brother who was not in the troupe, who was on stage just singing the song, right? So in Oakland, we do our little choreo, and we'd be like, and we'd look up, and someone would just go across the stage, shaking their solo. Somebody else would come up and take their solo. Don't let it be the end of the show and we're trying to do the finale. The whole front row, the only reason why those people bought those tickets
was to get on the stage.
And that lack of that, I mean, that's an actual formal piece of African and Black vernacular work, that those spaces, the formalized Western spaces, do not account for and can't. And, you know, it's legally you're in trouble. As a, you know, I produce events and sometimes I'm in trouble. I'm like, wait, don't snatch this person off the stage, right? Leave Black joy alone. So it's this really complicated thing. So I end up like wanting to do stuff outside. I do a lot of site specific work. Kind of for that reason. And even then, even if I get all of the documents signed, I did a work with my crew out in LA for the Los Angeles airports. We were commissioned by the city to do something for the flyaway bus. And of course, that necessitated us practicing out there. And the word, I guess, went around. And by the time it was showtime, a whole phalanx of cops showed up and walked and stood in formation in the mezzanine, which was glassed in, and looked down on our show during the whole piece, which was intense. Like that wasn't what I'd worked on. And, you know, to be policed in that way, but to keep going and to get extra, I mean, that's classic insurgent vernacular, right? Extra.
That's sort of what happens, you know, every Sunday pre-COVID for second line season, right? Which is this idea that this is a tradition where there is no separation between participant and spectator. Now there may be a focal point, which is the group that put the show on, and you'll know who they are based on the fact they're going to all be, you know, dressed somewhat alike, whatever. However, there's no separation. You know, it's called the second line because the first line is the social aid and pleasure group and the band. The second line is you. And there's just this interplay between participant and spectator. There's, you know, there's no separation. And it's just so interesting, as sort of like you were bringing up in terms of like how Western spaces it can't account or accommodate for that participatory quality, right? That so much of diasporic traditions possess. And it's sort of what Dent talks about in that interview, also in Beyond Rhetoric and in the interview with Jerry Ward, when he talks about what exactly makes a place, like what makes a place possible, what makes culture in a place possible. And so much of what he says makes the culture here possible is this kind of like a commitment to this lack of division between participant and spectator, and also to the point of what you said about being extra while being policed. You know, that's sort of the almost one of the sole purposes. It's not a reactionary thing. We're out there as much to see one another, mostly to see each other, right? And that's the great thing. You're out there mostly to see each other, but there's also a contingent of resistance, which of course this is heavily policed. It's being heavily surveilled, but it's a commitment, to be extra under surveillance.
I'm thinking about two kind of examples of that. One which may be very silly. Look, I'm backwards on the camera.
No, I know it's mirrored.
We have to get extra. Very silly in terms of the idea of being extra while under surveillance. I keep hearing 2 Chainz say, "I'm a course." And the other thing that I keep thinking about is the collection of folk stories that Hurston collects, and one of the first ones usually in that collection is A Flying Fool, and it tells the story of the guy who goes to heaven, and there's a guard. He knows he can't get in, he sneaks in, and they kick him out almost immediately, and he says, well, while he was up there, he was a flying fool. Right? The idea that the show is still going to happen because I came here to do what I came to do. Right. What happens after that is just what happens. And if you're going to watch, well, then let me give you something to watch. Right. I'm thinking so much too when you all
let me give you something to watch, because you should be down here doing. That's the other part of the extra, like that double dare. Get down here.
Yeah, you could do it too. Right. While you're being uptight, you could have been down here acting a fool with us, right? You followed the rules and missed out. Well, that's your fault. Right? This is just a very Southern thing also. Like, I'm thinking about when you all were discussing the participatory aspect of Black theater and of Black spaces and Black performance. I see that even so much in Black literature. I'm thinking first about Gloria Naylor's Mama Day and the opening, the introductory scenes in Mama Day. I know when I was in my MFA program, one of the things that seemed to really bother a lot of the white workshop participants is that I really liked to switch voice. That I would be telling a story in first person and then it would just instantly refer to, hey, you, in the second person, which I find to be something that particularly speaks to not only the vernacular tradition, but the participatory. That even when I'm writing on this page, I have to be able to hear a real voice telling a story, not this kind of disembodied Western literary narrator that kind of comes in like a news reporter and says, Jonathan woke up that morning and he was confused, right? And you don't know whose voice or what voice is telling you this story. The second person is a voice that is talking to you. So you have to talk back to it, even if that's just in your mind. You have to be able to participate with that voice. I think the end of that section, Mama Day, ends by saying, who's even talking to you? Ain't nobody there anyway.
Right. So is it like Egun? Is it like ancestors?
It's very much ancestor because she is relating the kind of ancestral backstory of Willow Springs, of like the island that she's talking about.
I think that too is a lot of why, in terms of how, Tom Dent approaches his writing career, sort of this decision that's referred to sort of be, to push yourself beyond being a writer, this decision to be a griot, right? Which is that he decides that because he's made that decision, he has to push his writing into all of the spheres, right? And so that's something that, at least personally for me, growing up, knowing Tom Dent's name because his father was the president of Dillard, so there's so many things that, there that refer back to the father. And then once I learned about Tom Dent and Free Southern Theater, getting into his work, both kind of his total body of creative work and this commitment to pushing his writing sort of into all of the genres, I think it sort of particularly comes out in his decision to write drama as well, to write fiction, to write nonfiction, do ethnography, and then push his work into drama. I just think it's something really powerful about that 360 decision as a writer, so that his words, they exist in so many multiple forms. Right. And I see a lot of Black artists, Black writers sort of taking a certain sort of attention to that. Like, how is it that we put our story into as many forms as possible in terms of that cultural transmission over time, especially when you're living in under surveillance, there's no other word for it, right? I sort of was thinking earlier today, I was having sort of a little bit of a hard time because I'm like, oh, this is a really auspicious, maybe, I don't know if that's the right word, night to have this conversation as I'm taking in sort of the news of the day. And then I said, well, no, maybe it's the exact time to try to have this conversation about how is it that you imagine or practice the concept of freedom while under a heavy state of surveillance. And this is something also that they teach us in their praxis from that time period, which is they were under heavy surveillance, maybe a different form than exists today for Black activists, but they were, in the ways in which they were attentive to telling their story in multiple forms so that some form of it survives, right? I thought that was a really powerful sort of takeaway I took away from reading all of the different kinds of work that Tom Dent attempts to write and then successfully writes, right? Like Beyond Rhetoric is very different than the play Ritual Murder, But as a writer, as a griot, he knows it's important that he do all of this, and just the incredible amount of dedication,
really interesting to think about the trace of that in the nation's life. Like, did you know that Gordon from Sesame Street was in Free Street, the Southern Theater?
I did not.
Right? Okay, so think on that for a second, because I'm too young to have known their work firsthand here, but they had what we would call today a cell that was active here in Holly Springs doing work. I'm actually from Holly Springs, and I left for a long time, and now I'm back, kind of like Dent. But we're looking at this way of like, when I was gone, I was thinking a lot about being undercover, right, and behaving a specific way so that I could gain access to our original documents, or at least as close as we could get to original documents. Like all of the books that French ethnographers did in the late 19th century through the early 20th. That's just, with those amazing photos and the Herskovitz collection at Northwestern. When I got there, I was like, oh my God, it's the actual tapes. Being able to hear people, our people, say these things, and then realize I've been heard these things, right? These things didn't go away. People still talk like this, even if they've changed up the scansion a little bit, even if they put it someplace else. And just recognizing that 360 that you're talking about that Dent made, and let's leave it in the present, because he's still making it, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah, currently.
There's nothing now. He's still making that 360. Person is still making that 360 with her ridiculous but behind her overalls and her hat, like just doing the thing. That 360 is super important. I think about when I got to my dissertation writing phase, I realized I was writing on Carnival in Bahia, and I realized I can't make a straight line with this. That would be a violence, because the carnival itself doesn't go in a straight line. It goes in a circle, and you get in when you can. Like, people literally show up and just jump into the parade with their crew, and they're not scheduled. They're not supposed to.
Right. That's how Black Carnival works. Yeah.
Right. Black people, they're just going to do their thing. So trying to figure out, well, how do I write this down so that people who might come across it, who are from there, or who are from a carnival culture in another part of that diaspora, will recognize themselves, right? How do I not stretch it apart and point all these things? So I got in a lot of trouble. I was like, it doesn't matter where you start. My committee was like, what? I was like, well, the intro, I wrote that for you. But you can start in any chapter, however you feel like it, because that's actually how Carnival moves. When you're thinking about the work of a scholar, activist, artist like Dent, like a Hurston, like a Pearl Primus, like Zora Neale Hurston, we're starting to see it with some folks right now. There are all these filmmakers that are actually making these interesting turns right now. Like, we'll see what Black Panther turned into now, right? There's just so much happening right now. People are recognizing the value of going undercover to do the research and having the strength to confront all of the ugly that's around the original material, right? And then bringing back our cosmological inheritance, like that which is ours and has been draped in stereotypes and coonery and whatnot, and revealing we've always had this, we're just in translation. But let me give it to you like this. You might need it like a rap. You might need it like a poem. You might need it like a recipe. You might need it like my drip, right? Like, you might need a certain look, right? You might need it as a piece of jewelry, but that conversation is fractal. And if, them that know it, feel it. Like, if you know what you're seeing in all these places, you can pull it together and activate. You can implement something from all these little tools placed about. Littlefield. Shall we show them this clip? And then you read that poem?
Yeah. Show them the clip of what you all have been working on in Mississippi. And then
do
we
you
can
want
kind
to set it up? Oh, I'm sorry.
Want to do a setup?
I'll do set up a little.
All right.
Okay, so we are in the process of building and developing a program in performance and Afro-Mississippi writing at Russ College. We have recently applied for a couple grants which are gonna come through, right? And so this is one of the videos that we sent in for our grant. It includes, obviously, Anna B. Scott, a few, and I feel like if I try to list everybody that's involved now, I'm going to leave somebody out. So,
okay, so Byron Chapman edited and he did the music. Danielle Littlefield, right there, wrote some of the lines. We had a little prompt. We were thinking about our town in particular. That it's a peaceful place, but is it? Okay. So, Sharonda Gibson also wrote, and Dr. Anisi Daniel Smith also wrote. The piece, the clip that I selected, because you're going to hear from Littlefield directly. I call her Littlefield. There's a whole story there. Is the end of Sharonda Gibson talking and moving into a segment where Anisi, Dr. Daniel Smith, is talking about pedagogy, which I think we've, in a way, been talking about this whole time. That actually the vernacular is a pedagogy itself, right? Oh. That if you're not doing your thing to the point where people don't feel it enough to do it with you, to replicate it, and then add to it, you have not done it. So we're thinking in this piece, she's thinking a bit about what it means to be a Black person in a classroom from either direction. The thing that's interesting about our process, because we're all in different genres, right? We just riff off of concepts because we're all, these scholar folks. And then we go away and make our jump, and then we come back together. We fix it in the mix. So the dancing you're going to see, the dancing was laid over the voicing. Okay. All right.
And so the poem that the piece that you're going to hear me reading is called "The Witness Tree Don't Hold Water," or just "The Witness Tree," and it was in response to this concept that Anna kind of brought to us about what we call an oppressive peace that Holly Springs, and then often even just a lot of other places in the South, can feel very peaceful in a sense, as long as you ignore everything that's going on. And as long as everyone who is suffering, primarily Black and brown people in the South, as long as everyone maintains the silence and doesn't speak to what is happening, then you can kind of live in this oppressive peace. And so this was in response to that concept.
Yeah, a similar concept may exist here via that communal entertainment culture, right? So long as everybody can dance together, everything is supposed to be okay. Yeah,
right.
Yeah, so it's an interesting concept. That's kind of how it plays out here, but it's interesting to bring that up. But yeah, looking forward to seeing it.
All right.
Okay.
As a whole, how you gonna win when you ain't right within?
Asking a question about living on the periphery, the part of us that has held back on its tongue. Silence from students who have already learned that speaking requires a currency that they do not possess or will not spend. Don't let your mouth write a check that your behind can't cash. We have all carried our packages of training with us into the classroom, holding them like shields over our hearts, slung over our backs like armor. The training that keeps us from speaking, even when our words are necessary for our own survival. If you can't say anything nice, don't say anything at all. Speak when you're spoken to. Whoso keepeth his, because it's always his in the book of holiness, and heritage speaks to that. Whoso keepeth his mouth and his tongue, keepeth his soul from trouble. Seen and not heard, not talking back. The spaces in which we teach and learn, originally designed to loosen the tongue and the mind from the grip of oppression, have become incubators of respectability. Oppressive peace is the helmet of salvation. Quietly do your work. Pass.
All right.
Okay, I'm gonna just go ahead and actually read my piece. Let's see.
Do you want us to show the video?
I can read.
Okay.
I can read. All right. The witness tree, or the witness tree don't hold water. I have heard these trees in Mississippi tell stories. Let the water keep all its secrets. Pearls from the river wash up in Jacktown. Current rush them up to Memphis. Let the past get out and play in the city. I heard the water got that gospel but don't testify. I heard the truth is in the blood. I heard the details drive them devils out from hiding in the mud. Listen, if you believe you love Mississippi, hear the lead-riddled quiet of its steel bodies. Hear these trees speak curses too ugly to repeat. I have heard voices from the past in Mississippi. Miss Medea say the tallest lady she ever seen was tall as 30 men, that if you climbed and climbed your whole lifetime, you could just touch the tip of her hem. People say she kept pecan candy for the kids. Yellow Papa Tree say he met a man named McGee, 500 some years old. Drive down to the beach and he'll bless your feet for a fee of silver and gold. I have heard these old trees in Mississippi tell fortunes. We are born of sanguine dust, Sahara sand and sinews, molten murk and fine silk, deposits withdrawn from the banks of our Nile. We will not bear dying fruit. We will gather these branches of our griots and be witness. We will sing blues enough to dye the ocean. We will dance down the rain of our dead. We will call our ancestors home. We will live and be Black in Mississippi.
Yes. Now let's be double extra. I'm just ridiculous now. Can you bring the video back? Because is it possible to bring it back, Denise? She might have closed out already.
See, I love it. More Black vernacular phrases. Look, doing too much is only
doing
just
too much.
If you ain't doing too much, you really ain't doing enough.
Every time I hear this poem, I'm like, oh my God, there's so much happening. For real though, if you can bring the video back, that would be great. And I'll give you a new in. Because I was just like, now they have to experience the mix. So just to give you some idea of like the rage of the vernacular, all of these different pieces. I went out by myself at first. All right, awesome. Can you forward it to slide it like 420? Let's see if that works. No, even further. So almost 5. And yeah, 5-7 was good. All right, so I went out on the street and did some clips myself, and then Byron showed up, and you can go ahead and start it. Byron went out and joined me a little bit.
Learning environment.
She recorded in her bedroom.
And generating.
We did this through Google Meet,
right?
Because COVID, B-roll, right? We all have different techniques and capacities. And then Byron, who's the musician, he scored this. That's his music.
Don't hold water.
Watch this.
I have heard these trees in Mississippi tell stories. Let the water keep all its secrets. Pearls in the river wash up in Jacktown. Current bring them up to Memphis. Let the past go and play out in the city. I heard the water got that gospel but don't testify. I heard the truth is in the blood. I heard the details drive the devils out from hiding in the mud. I heard repression is a death silent and sinking. Listen if you believe you love Mississippi. Hear the lead-riddled quiet of its steel bodies. Hear the trees speak curses too ugly to repeat. I have heard voices from the past in Mississippi. Miss Medea say the tallest lady she ever seen was tall as 30 men, that if you climbed and climbed your whole lifetime, you could just touch the tip of her hem. People say she kept pecan candy for the kids. Yellow Papa say he met a man named McGee, 500 some years old. Say you drive down to the beach, he'll bless your feet for a feet of silver and gold. I have heard these old trees in Mississippi tell fortunes. We are born of sanguine dust, Sahara sand and sinews, molten murk and fine silk, deposits withdrawn from the banks of our Nile. We will not bear dying fruit. We will gather these branches of our griots and be witness. We will sing blues enough to dye the ocean. We will dance down the rain of our dead. We will call our ancestors home. We will live and be Black in Mississippi.
Really beautiful, really beautiful, really beautiful.
Right.
I really appreciate sort of like just the way I see the conversation that these writers, were engaged in the 70s, and how 60s, 70s, and even before then, obviously, and how they did create such a through line to us in this, present moment. That's the thing also that I think is powerful about what you all are doing visually and on the page, and something I think is so powerful about what Tom Dent did through his work and what's accomplished in this volume is the work that we build, this archive that we build, how important it is to the future, right? So we're sitting in the future that this writer envisioned for us, right? And that's something that, a person conceived of as an individual can speak so powerfully, so, long past their physical departure, sort of to speak to the intro. And it says this idea of collectively being immortal through the work we create, the archive we create, the many different ways we figure out how to house that information so that it can, resist, change form when it needs to, revert back to its original form, do all the things it needs to do in order to survive, in essence, right? So I was thinking a lot when I was trying to think about this conversation, right? Thinking about Louisiana and Mississippi and what makes it so important to Black people's national freedom, and then also international, right? So a lot of the work I've done has really been thinking about how the city of New Orleans and how Black people's experiences in New Orleans really are like a microcosm for this greater macrocosm that you can see happening all over the world in different forms, right? So one particular one for me has been really spending this focused amount of time thinking about the crisis in the Mediterranean, all of these Black people, thousands of Black people who drown every year crossing the Mediterranean, and how that spoke so directly to what was happening to me in my city, right? And understanding like, this forced movement of Black people, right, is a global phenomenon, displacement, like realizing that the displacement is a global phenomenon for Black people. It's happening to us all over the world. So that if I could understand what was happening here, I could, have a greater understanding of what was happening sort of on a global scale. So I know that, Danielle, you spent a lot of time thinking about and researching different, literary movements, cultural movements. And I think that we are sort of obviously sitting in the middle of history, obviously, as we sit in our seats tonight as Black writers and artists who found themselves in that position throughout time, right? So I guess what I'm asking is for us to think and talk a little bit about what we see as necessary for Black artists and writers to do in this moment, and what do we see emerging? What do we see already out there? What do we see emerging in Black literature, art, and culture? For the good, the bad, all of it. Just what are we doing right now in the South as Black people, as writers, as artists, as regular people, not so regular people?
So I'll do just a little background of kind of my basic theory about the movement coming to the Black South, which is something I started to try to write about really over 10 years ago at this point. And it's been so affirming for me to read these places where Tom Dent basically said exactly this, and in the 70s. So the basic idea is that we can look at patterns if we can look at the Harlem Renaissance as kind of a prototype, and then the Black arts movement as a movement that builds upon that prototype, right, to develop something really very new. But what we see is that there's roughly 50 years between when those two movements happen. And really, we can even look further back than that, because we can really even look at like the slave narrative and the nonfiction writing of early Black writers as kind of the first motion that we really see as an announcement that like, hey,
we're literate.
We're going to do something.
We can read.
Right, wait for it.
Surprise.
It's about to go down.
Right. And so then once we get to the 1920s, we have this kind of culmination of political change and migration that kind of remixes Black people in different places. So not only do you have a movement upward of Black people out of the South to cities in the North and the East, and eventually also out West, but you also see a movement from rural areas in the South into Black cities and centers that are built, that are populated, become heavily populated by Black people during that time. So not only is that happening at the same time, but we're also seeing a strong influx of West Indian and African people also to those areas. And so this kind of fresh exchange of ideas, of culture, of writing, of practices, right, kind of creates just a kind of new person, right, a new culture, right, that is grown out of things old, put together in a different way. And so we see that starts about I feel like 1917 may actually be the first time that it is referred to in public and in writing as the New Negro Movement.
I think so.
1968 is when we see the Black arts movement.
We see Black power.
Later.
In Greenville.
We're sitting now almost exactly 50 years out. And we've had the same things, right? And so in 68, you see the same things have happened. You have like the kind of political change, upheaval. There are strong centers in the South, on the East Coast and on the West Coast, groups of Black theorists, thinkers, performers, artists, and activists that are all saying, no, actually, this is all one thing. We're not doing different things. This is all one idea. Immediately as the Black arts movement is dissolving, we have what reverse migration starts, literally right in the 70s, exactly as it. And what I thought 10 years ago, well, what that means, and 2010 was actually the first year that on the census, we have as many Black people in the South as pre-Great Migration. So we're a literal return home, right, of the children, the grandchildren of people who left the South, and now their children are all at HBCUs in the South, right? This is absolutely happening. Not only that, but I knew when I went to New York, which was really to, I think, try to live more as an individual. I thought somehow being anonymous and being an individual would make me able to be a writer. Because like a lot of people, I saw my home and my community as something that was holding me back. Right. And immediately, as soon as I got there, I was like, oh, no, my body is out of place. I don't even feel like my feet are on the ground. I'm going back to Mississippi. And what I knew kind of at that time was I was kind of late. I described myself as chasing the Great Migration, as like a late bird, kind of right behind the Great Migration, because everybody was already back here. So, and I see that even like in the Anna is back here, and other writers I know who went somewhere else, right, to be great as individuals, and eventually came right back here to build that practice in the place where we are now. So one of the things I think is absolutely has been necessary is that reverse migration, is that return home of actual people. And Tom Dent actually kind of refers openly to that and to quite a few passages. One, he writes, what was happening to those of us who wanted the Free Southern Theater to be a Southern theater is not so strange. Black Southerners ourselves, we had come to believe that the South is where we wanted to be. And though it had no ongoing theater, it could become the seat of a vital and alive Black theater in the same way it had given birth to most of our musicians, right? And so just kind of making this decision that, well, I could go be a great individual somewhere else, but it is more important for me to build for my community in my home, whatever the trouble is going to be. There isn't a Black literary scene. I'm from Memphis. There isn't really a Black literary scene. There is a burgeoning Black artistic scene, but it is very much has to be a part of the white gallery structure. Right. And so saying no, the thing to do now is to go home and build those community oriented workshops and programs and theaters and spaces that are going to house something that apparently Tom Dent already knew was going to happen here. He says in another section, not far from the one I read, he says, but the South is moving too. Just before that, he's been talking about what's happening in New York and other places. And he says, but the South is moving too, rather quietly and with a strong emphasis on economic development, but moving just the same. Who is involved? Black people and localities are organizing themselves to do the things the movement inspired, but did not do. It's slow, it's hard, it's unspectacular. Right, but at that time, he knew something is happening. I think one of the things that will be very important for this, what I think is absolutely a movement that is already happening, and I think this conversation is evidence of that, is that it has to be named and called out. It has to be so that people like us can coalesce around what is it that we're you know.
I think a lot about some of the things you were talking about, sort of in this 15 years since Katrina, right? So we have Hurricane Katrina, we have 400,000 people leave this state overnight, or leave this city overnight, basically, right? Because it's a forced evacuation. And then after that, everybody who's stuck here, if you survived being stuck here, then you're put out at gunpoint by the US military, right? You're put out of the city. We're sitting here 15 years later, it's still 100,000 people that are never, ever gonna return to New Orleans, kind of to date, right? And so many times, so like everybody else, I was gone. I was a young person, right? Right kind of at the outset of true adulthood in a sense. And so many people in that same position, and a lot of people, we've had this conversation either verbally or silently sometimes, like through just staring at each other in kind of love and horror sometimes, that we made this decision to come home. Whatever the reason you decided to come home after Katrina, if you were able, when you were basically, where you were elsewhere. But, we made this decision to come home and try to do a certain kind of work in a place that had been, kind of forcefully and purposefully vacated of this Black population. And so I guess I think a lot about what you're saying, sort of what is coming out of 15 years speaking from the perspective of Louisiana, of thinking about 15 years of Black artists, musicians, lay people trying to preserve, rebuild, and sustain this cultural inheritance, right, that we've been able to keep for so long. And I do think, like you said, something about the coalescing in this moment around these two states, even around Tom Dent as a literary figure, I think does speak kind of very powerfully to the point that you said that there's obviously something happening in the South right now.
Yeah, for me, it was being in Los Angeles, like, and realizing that there are a lot of highly talented Black artists of various types struggling for that same crumb. And there were people, you know, in their 70s having to decide, am I still going to go out for auditions? If I don't go out for auditions, am I going to be able to make it? And then thinking about the capacity that we have as a people in the South, that we just don't have there. If you even think about Tyler Perry Studios, it is not in Burbank. It is not in Long Beach. You know, and when I left LA, I went to Long Beach first because I was like, where are some Black people just being Black? And you didn't have to be doing things. It's because there's a certain performative Black that you kind of fall into when you're in these other spaces that was getting kind of aggravating for me. So I fell into Long Beach and loved it. I still have my place there. You know, I still go back and forth. It is very much a space where I feel sustained, also at a river, right? So apparently it's about the river. But this thing here, coming back here and thinking about all the stuff that I got to see as a child in the 70s, like I was little and cognizant of chocolate America, like at its height, right? You know, dashikis and afros and LTDs and soul music and people putting on their best furs and whatever and coming out to see Alvin Ailey, people going to the Ebony Fashion Fair every year. People getting dressed up to work the telephones for the United Negro College Fund. Balls coming through campus. You know, like you're remembering these really strange little things, like people playing spades and all the little kids running around acting crazy while the spades game accidentally turned into a party, accidentally turned into a block thing. You know, just like this, like the depth of love and the fecund nature of a future forward, because people were so attentive to the now. For me, that's why coming back made some sense. It was illogical. I was like, what am I doing? I just got into Long Beach. But I am understanding that at this point, those of us who must be exponential. We can't be small. And we can be incremental, but we're going to be exponential. And
we have to be in multiple places. Right.
Multiple places, because you can't just grind down and think you're in a groove. You will end up in a rut. And that has been the problem is like, you know, sitting on the couch in that one spot too long. And now the seat's no longer comfortable. That's why we left. We sat on that couch, whatever it was, our figurative couch too long. And now we realize, well, if I just scooted down to the next cushion on the couch, I probably could have stayed. It would have been okay. Yes, we do want to do a Q&A. So it is really, really interesting to think about that Tyler Perry axis. What's on the other end, right?
Yeah, we can also keep talking.
I'm really interested in like what ways this new wave or movement of production in the Black South will expand or grow from our prototype of the Black arts movement, right? So when I see the way that some of the schools of thought, like they ground us in theory, but they were often kind of so specific in a way that not causes them to dissolve, but eventually causes different types of dissension. And we'll always have that. I think one of the strengths of what is going to happen now is that we will see this sort of acceptance that and writers, everybody has to be exponential, and that everybody doing their own thing only strengthens what is happening, as opposed to saying that it challenges what other people are doing, right? So this kind of just idea of everybody having their own moving parts, and even some of those moving parts conflict, that sort of tension, that sort of back and forth, just like pedaling a bike, is what literally moves us forward.
Sure, yeah.
It really helps us progress to what is the next thing that has.
Yeah, Brent Edward Hayes talks about that in Practice of Diaspora, which I read in college and have used my whole life. So thank you to that professor who assigned that book. But he talks about this idea of the tension in the diaspora being the thing that creates movement. So when Black Americans are in France and they are there in France to sort of escape what is of the American style surveillance, and they're encountering these these continental Africans who are fighting the French, right? And there had this tension in the diaspora. They're like, this is what creates movement, actually, like a muscle. So that like a bicycle, the tension in the muscle is what creates the forward motion.
Which is exactly how the boson particle works.
Exactly, right. So I'm really, really
hard.
Right. Yeah, I'm really, really so thankful to the two of you all for like being so generous with your time, with your thoughts, with your ideas, with your practice, being generous with me. Because it's, it's been a challenge through these crazy hurricane season. We got Beta, sort of. I don't know what Tropical Storm Beta is doing, but it might be outside tomorrow or something like that. So I really appreciate you all, also holding space, to use that phrase, tonight for each other, to think through these ideas and thoughts and things that are so precious to us, that we spend so much time in our lives dedicated to, especially I think in a night like this in America, which is it's a night. It's one of those nights. And I think that I'm really grateful to have been able to do this tonight in that way, and grateful to Tom Dent for leaving us, something to have right now. So thank you all so much. And I'm sure we'll talk a lot more in the future.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, I think we have like a few minutes, like a couple minutes, if you all have any, last minute thoughts.
First, I just want to say thank you so much for, kind of inviting us to be a part of this conversation. I think it was really important for both Anna and I, especially given the program that we are working so diligently to build at Russ, which is very much a return to the past, because it's what Russ did before. Kind of during the Black Arts Movement. It's what Russ was known to do before. And so this kind of return that we're making to the past, but with the future in mind. So thank you just for kind of having us. And thank you for your work. I've seen a lot of your work right before the pandemic, literally like 2 days before they started shutting everything down. I came out to New Orleans and got to see your exhibit. And I just was so glad that I made it to see that right before I couldn't go anywhere. It was such a gift, and it did a lot for me in terms of just kind of seeing the possibilities that my experience and my life brought, so just thanks for that. Also, I am curating in a show right now with B. Sam and Bill T. Jones, New York Live Arts, which is the third installment of Curating the End of the World. This third installment is Red Spring, and it speaks to kind of cyclical chaos, which Renee Thomas came up with that concept, and kind of like refers back to the Red Summer idea, that this been the Red Spring that is going to like lead us, we hope, to new life after this. So please, check that out. It will go up in October, I think October 20th.
Thank you. Thank y'all. We will talk again soon, hopefully. Thanks so much to One Book, One New Orleans, and also UNO Press for having me. I will talk to you all ladies soon.
Wow, I'm going to watch that 10, 15, 20 times, and so can you guys, because these things will live in perpetuity on our Facebook and our YouTube. So please feel free to download those things, share those things as you all see fit. We really want Tom Dent's work to reach its widest audience possible. Speaking of the name Dent, shout out to Lindsay Dent, who's watching tonight. That's Tom Dent's niece. And shout out to the entire Dent family. They've been really amazing and supportive this year. Thank you guys so much for coming to the events, cheering us on as we celebrate your uncle, your brother. And I'm actually really excited that you guys brought up the play Ritual Murder tonight, because I'd love to tell you guys to stay tuned for November 22nd. That's the last day of our festival, the Words and Music Festival. And we're devoting that day to Tom Dent. The No Dream Deferred Theater Company is going to stage a live virtual reading of Ritual Murder as part of the festival. So please tune in to watch that. It's going to be incredible. They say they're done casting soon, so watch for that announcement. And we will see you guys in the next installment. Thank you again to Anna, Kristina, and Danielle for your words of wisdom and your time and your expertise. And special thanks to our tech guru, Candace, who's working behind the scenes to make us look good. We could not do this without you. Literally, we don't know how. So thank you so much to everyone who participated and showed up. And thank you especially to UNO Press. We appreciate you all. Good night.